Hello, friends. Welcome back to Mr. Keneally's desktop. It is lovely to be interacting with you. Um, all right. Yesterday, talked about Malcolm X. We've covered Martin Luther King Jr. Now, remember, there were a lot more people involved in the Civil Rights Act. All right, so we're just doing a brief overview this week. Um, excuse me. So today, just want to take a look at the Civil Rights Act. And so here's another image of Lyndon B. Johnson as the president that signed it. But at this point in time, the government is facing a lot of pressure to make this change and to pass this law. So I thought we'd go back a little bit and talk about how it got started. So remember when we talked about the Civil War and the end of the Civil War and the Reconstruction era? Well, during that Reconstruction era, there was, the South particularly was rampant with racism. This is a time period when the KKK became prevalent. And really all through the United States, there was this idea that, okay, we're not going to have slavery anymore, but certainly we're also not going to have equality. But then in the Supreme Court case called Plessy v. Ferguson, there's this argument, and this is in 1896, so well after the Civil War and the Reconstruction, that there should be separate schools. Okay, so this is mainly in the South. And that they said, we can have separate schools for blacks and whites, but they'll be equal. All right, so we can keep things fair, but we're going to keep them separate. And so all but one of the Supreme Court justices agreed with this argument and said, all right, schools can be separate but equal. And this idea spread throughout society, particularly in the South. But there are examples in the North as well. In the North, oftentimes it wouldn't be as obvious. There weren't as many signs, but there were oftentimes, these social expectations that African Americans sit in a different place in a restaurant, or use different facilities than whites. In the South, this was very blatant. They had signs. They had white only restaurants, white only water fountains, white only swimming pools. They segregated the schools and including neighborhoods as well. Okay, a person of color cannot buy a house in a white neighborhood. They certainly couldn't get a loan to do that, and so certainly if they attempted to do that, there would be some consequences, including violent ones. And so it took until 1954 for the Supreme Court to declare that segregated schools were inherently unequal. So the Supreme Court ruled on that in 1954 in Brown v. Board of Education. Said basically like, look, we've got 60 years of evidence of this, and these separate schools are not being treated equal. And this was true. The white schools had much more funding, had newer buildings, had newer textbooks, had more funding for teachers. The schools were built in the neighborhoods, whereas schools for African Americans, there were much fewer, and they weren't often built in their neighborhood, so there were long bus rides or walks to school, and just everything about it was not equal. And so this is when the desegregation started. Some of it was peaceful, but most of it was not. Most of it was not, and it took a lot of protesting and a lot of brave students willing to go into those white schools and to desegregate those schools. Um, all right, so this is also sort of the time period where groups such as the NAACP and CORE became much more influential, and the NAACP believed in fighting things through the courts, and still what they do mostly today. And so when the Civil Rights Act was passed, ended a lot of the laws that created this unequal society. Okay, but it took, and it continues to take time to end what we've created in society. Those sort of unequal ways that we treat people in our society. The laws can't dictate. That's something that we have to take care of ourselves. The way that we act and the way that we treat each other. Okay. So that's the Civil Rights Act. Tomorrow, we're going to take a quick look at an example of people who took action, took this nonviolent action. These freedom riders. Talk a little bit about them. Let me know if you got any questions. Otherwise, have a great day.